This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to this dialogue special series, New Vision, New Mission. The recently concluded 20th CPC National Congress reiterated China's commitment to reform and opening up with an emphasis on China's future institutional opening up. What is unique about this institutional opening up? How will it address the domestic challenges currently facing China's development? And what impact may it have on foreign investment in China? To help us answer these questions, I'm glad to be joined today by Anna Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, Andy Mok, senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Chen Jiahe, chief investment officer at Novem Arcade Technologies, and Wang Dan, chief economist at Hang Seng Bank, China. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Wang Dan, I will start with you. Whether China will continue to reform and opening up, this has been an issue. You can see people are paying attention to both domestically and externally. Why it is so important or critical to China in terms of continuous reform and opening up?
Well, this is China's unchanged attitude to embrace globalization. Because when you think about the success story of China in the past 40 years, reform and opening up was the foundation. And now with the 20th Party's Congress suggesting a new path for China to become a global power in technology and to strengthen its supply chain, actually opening up will provide more channels for China to collaborate with other countries, import more technologies, and improve the domestic market.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jiahe, at the brief meeting between the new standing member of the CPC Central Committee and the press, President Xi Jinping made a statement saying that China's door to opening up will be wider and wider. China will continue the reform and opening up in a comprehensive manner. So that's a very clear message that China is to continue its reform and opening up policy, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the global economy has really been concerning about whether China will keep on opening up as we have been doing in the past 4 decades and do better and better, or are we possibly closing up? Some people are really guessing that. You can see in the stock market. The stock market has really been fluctuating these days. But I think most of the people are really believing China is opening up. You see a lot of foreign capital are coming to find long-term investment opportunities in China. And we have actually been fully invested in the Chinese market, about 40% in Asia and 60% in Hong Kong. We're quite confident with our holdings of stocks. These companies offer us like a 9% return on equity and 8% dividend yield. I mean, all these success of investment would be basing on the fact that China will keep on opening up and the Chinese economy will be better and better.
Mm-hmm. Andy, obviously, the concern has something to do with the pandemic policy, the dynamic zero, COVID policy. People would say, oh, is China closing the door, or is China to continue its reform and opening up? What's your understanding?
Well, Qingduo, I think certainly we've seen drastic changes since the beginning of the COVID pandemic in terms of the ability for foreign businesses, foreign individuals to engage in China. But that being said, I think the worst is behind us in that, of course, China has shown that COVID can indeed be managed and this dynamic zero policy does work. But the second thing I think we need to point out, too, is we are seeing an optimization of this process where the quarantine periods are becoming much shorter. For example, I recently was outside of China, came back, and it was a 7+3 day quarantine versus 21, I believe, at the height. Also, the system is becoming more, I would say, more predictable in terms of air flight and sort of flights, how to apply for different, to do different procedures, is all becoming very transparent and standardized, as we would expect. And we need to recognize, too, just how important these measures are, because as bad as COVID was, I think we all know that this will not be the last public health crisis the world faces. And I think what China has done is developed a robust system, and the outlook, I think, looks better in that, we do hear some talk, even rumors, that there may be some dramatic changes soon. But I think that certainly the direction is that towards greater openness and a resumption of engagement with the outside world, whether that's for diplomats, whether that's for corporate executives, or whether that's for students.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anna, it seems like it also has something to do with probably the, say, foreign relations, in particular China's relationship with the United States, in response to the U.S. containment policy, basically technology, trade, etc. So China has adopted this dual circulation, so-called internal circulation, and plus China and the rest of the world. That's probably also creates some doubts, like whether China is seeking to rely on itself, in particular in technology sector. Somehow the door will not be as open as in the past.
Well, Chintu, I mean, there's a couple of things that I would point out. There was an economist named Edward Deming. He believed and pioneered the Japanese auto industry and made it what it was by constant quality improvement. This idea that you're never at the end of the road, you're simply in the middle of it, and you continue going forward. And that is, in essence, what China has adopted with this continuing reform and opening up. It's an attitude that says, look, the world is dynamic. Economics are dynamic, and so do economies. So they're constantly changing. In terms of international relations, unfortunately, there's a lot of kind of nostalgia in Europe, in the United States, and other parts that say, oh, let's go back to time, when times were great. For Donald Trump, I think it was the 50s. For Biden, I think it's the 70s. But you can't go back. The world is moving on. The U.S. is kind of stubbornly holding on to this idea that it will remain dominant in the world on all spheres, political, economic, and security. And it's not working. It's not working for neighbors. It's not working for their allies, and it certainly isn't working for the rest of the world. So at this juncture, China is really just reacting to the dynamics it finds itself in. It did not make this push towards high tech because it had access to the West. The U.S. surreptitiously just said, look, we're cutting you off. And they continue to try to box China in. So China really doesn't have any alternatives except to say, look, we're going to have to make the best of a bad situation. There'll be some suffering in the short term. But medium, and long term, China will be resilient. Remember, China is not going to change. You don't change a successful pattern. And since 2013 to 2021, China contributed almost 39% of the world's GDP increase. And that is more than the entire G7 put together. So if you're talking about results-oriented change, if China is being successful, why would they change? It might behoove the G7 to start thinking about the success of what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wang Dan, back to you here. China has been following this reform and opening up the path for 40 plus years. And then in this report delivered by Xi Jinping at the 20th CPC National Congress, he especially stressed about institutional opening up and policy. Tell us, what does that mean? Institutional opening up, this term. What does that specifically mean, probably in practical daily lives in business community?
China's opening up in the past mostly focused on the flow of capital and goods. We talk about foreign trade, import and export. We talk about overseas investment, foreign direct investment into China. But there have been new patterns emerging in the past decade. We have seen more cross-border exchange in information, in labor, and in all kinds of different financial services. So in this background, only stressing on trade is not enough. Only stressing on investment is not sufficient for what China going to do in the next stage. So by focusing on the institutional change, the policy will really be reoriented to a direction that focuses on rule of law, establishing a better business environment, setting up standards that are in better coordination with other countries. And this will be particularly beneficial in China's green transition and in its ambition to becoming a global leader in climate change-related policies.
Jiahe, do you agree that by applying to join this CPTPP, which is seen as high-end trade agreement, as one of them pointed out, there are some requirement basically in some tough area like environment protection, labor issue, etc., institutional changes, that kind of requirement inside China?
Well, I think when we say the institutional opening up, that's really important for China. I mean, that brings things like environmental improvement, labor conditions, these kind of things. These are what Chinese people really need. We don't just need a GDP figure, economic figure growth. We also need better environment, cleaner air, which we have seen in the past 5 to 10 years. The air in Beijing, for example, has been significantly improved. I have been living here every day. I know the changes. It's been huge change with the air. And when we talk about China joining the international organizations, taking all these standards, it's really fitting what China is right now. I mean, look at 20 years ago, we were having like a per capita GDP of about a few hundred $US back 20 or 30 years ago. And now we're having like 12,000 or 13,000 thousand per capita $. So that's a very high amount of GDP right now, since that China has 1.4 billion population. So it is really the time for China to set a higher standard for our own economy, our export, these kind of things.
So Andy, so there's a necessity probably, or at this particular stage, China needs to focus on the institutions, the regulations, and laws, instead of solely focusing on trade and investment, because there's a need, domestic need, as well as probably the need to deal with the international community, for example, globalization.
No, that's absolutely true, Qingduo. So from an institutional perspective, I think the other thing that's important to point out is that from the beginning of economic reform until perhaps we could say 2017, China enjoyed perhaps a historically unique strategic window of opportunity where a lot of the global political forces, I think, were much more benign. And what we've seen is that the environment has become much more challenging geopolitically, not just with the U.S. launching a full-scale aggression to contain China's technological development, but the unfortunate situation in Ukraine, that's become a much more difficult environment. And as a result, institutions have to adapt to these challenges. The other thing I would say, too, is that it's not just some of these economic organizations like we've talked about, or arrangements, but also things like DEPA, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement with Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, which China's expected to join, as is South Korea, because we recognize in this interconnected world, working together, developing standards is vitally important. The other point related to this, too, I think, is China's efforts and leadership at the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, in terms of addressing some of the shortcomings with the existing internet, and how do we move to a digital future that is more secure, able to support the Internet of Things, as well as much greater digital flow of information amongst people, so to be machines, people, et cetera. So institutional development and innovation, I think, is absolutely vital.
Well, and the Chinese efforts of institutional opening up, obviously, it's a kind of a way, as one pointed out, to continue. I think a previous speaker mentioned the globalization. But now we are facing the trend of actually what do we call it, a withdrawal of globalization or deglobalization. So that represents some kind of a challenge, obviously.
Well, the world is increasingly splitting, fracturing along some very defined lines. If you start looking at the global south, and then Central Asia, you see not only economic divergence, and it's not that they're running towards China. It's simply that they're not enthralled with what the U.S. is offering, which is basically this spoke and wheel thing, where the U.S. is at the hub and every country is connected to it through some sort of bilateral. China's offering these multilateral things where people are treated as equals, and that is far more attractive than this kind of post-colonial model that the U.S. is pushing. So you really have the developed North, including Japan, South Korea, Europe and America, Canada, etc. They're diverging along those lines. I mean, there was just a vote in the UN on condemning an action in Israel about nukes, and you can notice the voting patterns. And these, if you start going back over the last 30 years, you start to see more and more countries walking away from supporting the U.S. in a lot of these issues and developing independent voices. And I think that will continue on the economic level, especially as China offers a better model. For instance, China right now, when somebody says reform and opening up, I think efficiency. I think how China is lowering the cost of production in China by investing in the road infrastructure, by investing in the kind of industry 4.0 that will make it far better, not only in terms of logistics, but also on the manufacturing floor and the supply lines to keep prices very low and to keep China competitive.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the institutional opening up, that probably means our purpose is to develop China itself, but also to attract more foreign investment. At least, not really because of the Chinese development here, but if you look at the European continent, for example, in Germany, some of the companies are shifting to the US or to China because of the energy shortages, the crisis over there. So you do see that this kind of competition probably is necessary for businesses, for economies like China, US, probably Europe, EU, the global South, to strengthen themselves, either institutional efforts or other kinds of efforts to be more attractive?
Yeah, I mean, those countries, the rise and fall of economic centers has been, testified throughout history. I mean, you had Italy, Venice, what at one time was a center, obviously China, the Middle East, the Persian Empire. It comes and goes based on the ability of these, these trade centers to be productive, to serve the markets that they're in. And you're seeing the same kind of dynamics. Right now, Europe is virtually, it's impossible to manufacture there because of the inflation and the just pure availability of energy. So at this juncture, you're seeing many companies fleeing. Some are coming to China because, once again, it's about the efficiency, global competitiveness, etc. And then you're starting to see some countries like the U.S. Erecting these artificial trade barriers. We've seen this before during the Great Depression, during the 1929, 1930s. It doesn't work, but for some reason, we haven't learned that lesson. Let's hope that people wake up soon.
Mm-hmm. Let's have a short break. We will continue our discussion right after this. Welcome back. Well, one damn institutional opening up, it reminds me of this CAI, the agreement, comprehensive agreement on investment between China and the European Union. Of course, it was put on shelf by the EU side because of the political consideration or geopolitical consideration. But anyway, that kind of efforts represents the attempt on the Chinese side, for example, to provide more access to its market financially. Some of the relaxation of the rules to make it easier for foreigners to make investment in China, etc. So that's, typical institutional opening up.
For the China-EU relation, the investment relation has always been a tricky one. because we have seen some major development recently. For example, China's holding of the German port. That's actually in line with China's Belt and Road Initiative by investing its global infrastructure investment. And for EU's investment in China, they have a real advantage in financial services, in pension services, and also consumer-related products and services. So Chinese market is lucrative. But in previous decades, China's market access was lagging. There were a lot of opportunities that foreign investors want to tap in, but there are different requirements in compliance, in capital flow. So it had been working as a deterrent for those foreign investors. And now when we've recenter our attention to the institutional change, that actually means the cost of doing business in China is likely to be reduced quite significantly. And I believe that is good news for European investors.
Well, Jiahe is, I think, World Bank, they issue a yearly report on the ease of doing business, basically, in different economies. To say if it is easier, of course, it attracts more investment. In China's case, more foreign investment. Not long ago, the Chinese top economic planner, NDRC, issued measures, 15 measures to attract, to stabilize foreign investment. And then in the China International Import-Expo, which is upcoming in Shanghai, there's a subsection basically focusing on from exporters to investors, again, foreign investment. So, I mean, at least from these, policies, measures, you can see the Chinese government's attitude is very clear. That is, they cherish and they value the investment from overseas, which is critical to Chinese economic growth.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when we read all the papers published from China's central government, we can see that China has been following the path that we have been really successful in the past for over 40 years. I mean, we have grown from a very small amount of the global economy to now the world's second largest economy because we kept on opening up, because we kept on attracting foreign capital, because we have so many foreign investors in China. So this theory has really been proved as successful. So China is really following that. And because when we look at the Chinese economy right now, we're having a very large amount of population, but the per capita GDP is still, well, at a developing level, which is about $13,000 per capita. So that means we have a large potential. So maybe like another 30 or 40 years from now, you will see that China's economy is probably the largest in the world, and we will be more able to be connected with the global market.
Andy, externally, obviously there are challenges we mentioned earlier. Deglobalization, the trend. For example, the United States and some developed countries, they say, you know what, the globalization is not really in our interest because China benefits more from globalization. So no, we are saying no to globalization. We are focusing more in the U.S. cases more. All kinds of camps, for example, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or Cheap 4 Alliance, or Quad system, or this AUKUS, more geopolitical grouping, let's say. And then, European Union is facing its own challenges with the energy shortage, the Ukraine crisis, and the food crisis, for example. Here, China is a bit different. It's a stable, large economy. It has a long view about its future development. But there are challenges, obviously, externally because of the U.S. Influence from the U.S., geopolitical consideration. Some European countries even think, oh, you know what, we should have a distance probably. We should reduce our so-called, quote-unquote, reliance or dependence on China. What do you make of that?
Well, I think these challenges are very real. But I think in the long run, economic forces are really like physical forces like gravity, that they always prevail. And the most important thing that I think the theme that has been running through our conversation today is the importance of governance. So we see a lot of the challenges that Europe is having today, arguably even the crisis in Ukraine, are really at its root political governance problems. In the United States, we see also lots of challenges that, again, I think we can ultimately say are due to governance. Whereas in China, we see major companies like BASF, who recently decided to permanently stop production in Germany because of the unpredictability of the economic environment, because ultimately of political causes, dramatically expand their operations in China. And we see many, many other examples of this. And that this governance will drive a lot of the changes, including attracting talent from all around the world to China over time, addressing some of the energy transition to a more sustainable energy future also in time. And I think one of the most important things I want to mention, Qingduo, that is vitally important, that's one of the biggest risks facing the world today, is the US dollar. With the rising interest rates, that's creating enormous problems for companies and countries around the world. What China is doing in terms of institutional reform as well is creating an alternative, not to replace or dethrone the dollar, but to create an insulation from these dangers that I think is good for the world. And what we can see going forward is the big theme, I think, in this new era is that China's institutions are explicitly prioritizing being more robust. So development, creating greater prosperity for the people of China is still important. But being robust and resilient enough to absorb these shocks, whether they're geopolitical shocks, public health shocks, other types of exogenous shocks, really is what's going to drive the future for China and result in many of these good things that we talked about today.
Mm-hmm. Well, lastly, the question for you here. Obviously, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is coming to Beijing, so that itself in European some quarters in European, that's a bit controversial too. But also it's a clear message that is there are forces for more trade and investment, more interaction, more engagement.
The economic relationship with China is an important one for Germany. And we have seen the long-term investment from German companies in Chinese provinces. And most of those investments have been focusing on manufacturing, especially high-end manufacturing, and that's consistent with China's economic transition that is aiming for the innovation-based economy. But one thing I find interesting is that the biggest interest from the German business community is overwhelmingly in the new energy industry. And that is one industry that Germany is in direct competition with China. And if we look at the market share of new energy vehicles that's produced in China in Europe, it is now at 10% market share. And that's quite unbelievable because if we think about the traditional engine, combustion engine cars, China's traditional combustion engine cars market share in Europe is practically zero. So in the future, if this market expands and with China's technology advantage in this sector, it will pose a strong competition to German car makers like BMW or Volkswagen. And now more collaboration is actually in urgent need between the two sides to develop this supply chain and to become more of a business partner rather than the direct competitor in the future.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qingduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.